Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to Coach's Corner. No Bam today, but we got Ramses, Tony, and myself. And today's topic, we looked through some of the comments and we saw some of the things you guys suggested. Conditioning is one of those things you guys wanted us to go over. So before we go over it, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you guys are enjoying the content. And make sure to let us know in the comments below what kind of topics you want us to go over, whether it be characters or general aspects of the game. Just let us know down below. So today's topic, conditioning, I feel like this one it's very broad, and so conditioning generally is getting your opponent to do what you want them to do and then you punish them for it, right? And then you can get like a pretty hard read, or you can have specific game plans around what you've conditioned them to do. I think at top level play, conditioning becomes more so just like, oh, well, you're supposed to do X, so then I'll punish you for doing X, Y, or doing X, right? So I think that's the main thing. Like, for example, I mean, we had an episode that talked about a lot of Plan A, Plan B characters, where it's just like, oh, Cloud backers, very, very strong. You shield. Cloud grabs you. Cloud doesn't get a lot off of said grab. Well, kind of, right? Like, you don't get a lot right then and there, but the ledge trap or the juggle situation could be really strong for Cloud, right? So I think conditioning, a lot of it falls into the Plan A, Plan B, and it's been a while since we talked about those kinds of characters. Or I mean, that episode we did was quite a while back. I don't even remember the title of that episode. But yeah, how do you guys feel about conditioning? I mean, just like general thoughts about it, Ramses.
I'll I'm on a negative spree. I was talking about ult rank and now we're here. I really don't like the term conditioning
Okay.
because it implies control over the opponents when there really is none. So it's kind of like I conditioned you to jump. And I think in a lot of cases that is not really true, or it's at least a very limited way of looking at a situation. Um, for example, right, like you said, Cloud Beckers you a lot, forces you to shield, and then mixes up your shield. But in reality, like, the opponent has a lot of control over those situations. Like, are they positioning to get hit by the Beckers? Are they interrupting your Beckers? Are they shielding? Are they parrying? Are they moving around? Are they, full hopping over it? There's so many things that they can do that oftentimes it's less about I'm conditioning you to shield, and it's more like I'm establishing this option. Let's play RPS. And when we think about it through the lens of RPS, what we're introducing is, well, a concept of interaction, right? Like, I'm establishing a certain option. What is your counter to it? And instead of me controlling how you act in a situation, it's more, well, it's more interactive. That's what it comes down to. And I think a lot of students that I get, they're kind of like, yeah, I try to condition these options, and like, if it works, I'll do great, and if it doesn't, then like, I'm kind of lost. And I think a lot of that is because, again, the term kind of implies a certain control. So in that sense, I think the term is limited. It is very limited in trying to convey what is actually important. I do think the idea of conditioning, in other words, trying to funnel your opponent into a certain set of actions, I think it's very powerful. But I think it should be approached, again, more from an RPS perspective rather than like a control perspective. And because a lot of the times in this game, you're doing things your opponent knows you're going to do, but they don't know how you're going to do it. So for example, like, I can quote unquote condition Cloud to rely on short hop back air because I am, stuffing out his ground game. But what really happens is Cloud has so many ways to deal with that. It's not really that I'm conditioning him to rely on Becker. I'm just, I'm just funneling him into air game. So that is kind of that's my general approach to the concept of conditioning. I think if you start looking at it more from that perspective of like, okay, where am I trying to funnel them rather than like, what am I trying to condition out of them, I think it becomes a lot more meaningful as a term. I think overall, again, in this game, a lot of times you're doing things the opponent knows you're going to do, but you don't know how. So like, I can funnel Cloud into air game, but I don't know if it's going to be short hop back air, short hop, like full hop, short hop, fast fall, slow fall, drift mix-ups, timing mix-ups, spacing mix-ups, right? There's so much variation, and the same goes for like advantage. Like you can try to read a double jump out of disadvantage, but there's a lot of timings at which they can double jump, and after the double jump they can, like, they can fast fall air dodge, they can do an aerial, they can maybe stall if they have a special that stalls them. So yeah, a lot of the time I think, especially for this game, because of the input delay, but also the speed of the actions in this game, it's just hard to be precise enough to say you're going to jump and I'm going to catch the jump all the time. So once you start, again, thinking about it more from a funneling point of view, I think to me at least, that's going to help a lot with how you should mentally approach the concept of conditioning. What do you think, Tony?
Well, so as both Charles and Ramses mentioned, it's a matter of essentially RPS. So the first thing you want to establish is whether or not the opponent is essentially using their reflexes of responding to things and trying to react to what you're doing, or if they have something they're already going to do regardless of whatever they see you do. So basically, whether or not they have their metaphorical eye closed. And so the idea is you want to decide if they're reacting, if they're acting proactively, and then if they are acting proactively, what is their plan to do so? Like, for example, is it the same opening against every other player that you've ever seen, or is it something that is specifically geared towards your character? Is it something where they actually studied you ahead of time and they have a plan for how they're going to counter you, et cetera, et cetera? So the idea is this also channels into things like tempo. Maybe they're going to do things in such a rhythm, or maybe they're going to do things because they have an ABC pattern memorized where they're just going to rotate at a set pattern. And it could be any of these things, and you have to figure out which one you have. So an issue that I think some people have is that they actually don't have a reflexive system in the first place. And I think that this is both the most common for players to have, and it's also the most important to develop for yourself if you don't have it. And what that is essentially you need to, if you see a green light, you hit go on the gas. If you see a red light, you stop. So since we're at my workplace and I happen to work in a wonderful place, one of my favorite metaphors to use for this is actually to use an electric door that slides. And so the idea is there's usually a system in place in which the door can make decisions on whether or not it should be closed or whether or not it should be open. And so what you want to look at is you want to ask yourself, well, what is my success condition here? And in this case, you want to walk into a closed door. And the door's objective is to be open when you walk through so that you can make it in. And so if your competition is against the door and you want to walk into the closed door and the door wants you to be open, then what you can do is essentially you figure out what its reflexive system is. And so starting off here, we can see that the door is open because it saw me approach. And so it is executionally correct for the door to open as soon as it sees me coming, and then to ideally stay open until I reach such and such a distance. So what the door's downside is, though, is that every time it closes, it has to open again. And so every time it opens, it also has to close again. And so if I look at that period of time between them, I can ask myself in advance, well, what is the door's habits? Like, what is the time that it takes for the door to close, and what is the time it takes for the door to open? And so as I'm walking through, well, first of all, the door is broken over here, so I'm going to the other one. But for those listening on Spotify, you can actually see me walking through my workplace's corridors for reference. So, seeing here, we can see very clearly that the door is closed. And then, sure enough, as soon as I walk up, it starts to close. Or it opens, and then when we come back, it closes again. And so if my objective to move into the closed door is, then I can move fast, which is one solution. Or the other solution is, which is generally what you want to do, is you start moving into higher levels of conditioning and play and using the mental stack, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to wait for the door to start to close, and then I'm going to move in while it's closing, so that essentially the door is having to make the decision, am I going to be open or am I going to be closed? And so because it can't just pick one option every single time, it's going to either have to essentially turn off the sensor system in order to counter me and just stay closed, or it's going to have to stay open, in which case there's a different opening. So if it stayed open, then I could just let it go, and essentially it's going to lose all its air conditioning, and that would be my B plan for victory. So the next thing that we're going to look at is we're going to ask ourselves, well, what is another way we can counter that? And that essentially would come down to the other major counter is that the door can just have a set subsystem. So if somebody were to turn off the door's motion sensor, that would actually counter my play of moving forward to feint it to close. And then so it could ignore my feint. And then all of a sudden now my game plan no longer is going to work because my conditioning has been removed, has been turned off essentially. And so at this point, what we would have is we would have that rock, paper, scissors that Charles was mentioning before, where essentially my opponent can counter my conditioning by just not being conditioned. And then I can counter them closing their metaphorical eye by just walking forward and hitting them in the face, which is the solution to many life problems. So at that point, it would just be a matter of just going in there. And as we saw with the door before, if you move in fast enough, if their reflexes aren't prepared, then the set's already over right then and there. You can just keep hitting them as fast and as hard as you can. And this is where you get characters like Fox, Mithra, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what's so powerful about these characters is that they can always rush you down and they can force you to actually be honest with your reflexes. And then it's a matter of athleticism. Are you fast enough to respond to Mithra's dash attack? Probably not. And so you need to react to the positioning for her to be in position to dash attack preemptively. And so in that case, well, what if Mithra just takes a step forward to act like she's going to dash attack and then waits for you to counter her dash attack? Then all of a sudden you're opening yourself up. And so, and that's on top of, well, what if Mithra were to walk up and dash attack versus run up and dash attack versus jump in or empty hop in and then dash attack? These are all different timings. And so even if you were to know exactly what Mithra is going to do, you can't counter exactly what that is without also being able to consistently pick what timing it is. Because just because you know what's coming does not mean that it's going to be an entirely perfect prediction or anticipation of that. You need to take the other elements or dimensions of what this decision is. And so you need to consider things like timings. Where is this going to take place? Why is this happening in the first place? And the more of these questions that you can answer, the more likely you will be able to read that conditioning. But so ultimately, conditioning is just a side piece of this because it first requires that your opponent be playing rock, paper, scissors, essentially. Because if the entire game is based on reflexes, like let's say it's just Light playing against himself, it's probably going to be two people playing rock and bottom soccers as fast as they can. And so I believe the idiom that I like to use here is whenever one door closes, another door opens. And so ultimately what it's about is you figure out which door is open, and then you just walk through the open door. And then if your opponent counters it by closing that door, you just walk to the other door because there's a new one that it might not have even been open before. But fundamentally, whenever someone counters you exploiting something, they are creating a new vulnerability somewhere else. And so you need to understand that every single time your opponent counters you, they made a new vulnerability, even if you didn't notice that it was there. And so ultimately what higher levels of adaptation are, is it's a matter of figuring out which hole is created every time your opponent adapts to you. Because there is always a weakness that they are creating every single time. Nothing is without exploit.
It's opportunity cost at the end of the day, right?
Ooh,
Yep.
opportunity cost. Yeah, we're bringing in the big terms.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's weird because the more you break down conditioning, the more it really just is adaptation, right? But I think conditioning is just a term we've used forever. I don't know when the term started becoming popular, but I remember using the term back when I was like in high school playing Brawl competitively. So it's been around for a really long time. I I do feel like it's kind of outdated in terms of just like the actual application. Like the more Ramses talked about, and even Tony talks about it, like at the end of the day, conditioning is just how fast you adapt, right? Because when someone's conditioned, and the big thing about conditioning is that your character has to be good enough to put you in a really fucked up scenario where it's like, oh shit, I only have really like 2 or 3 options, right? And if your character's not top tier, like newsflash, it's going to be harder for like Ganon to condition you rather than Fox or Cloud, because when Fox or Cloud back air your shield, you don't really have a ton of options. You have your options are very limited. So the first thing I want to say is the better your character, the more opportunities you will have to condition, right? But realistically, conditioning is just like TLDR, it's adaptation and how quick you adapt to these scenarios. But it's adaptation paired with like, oh, is the scenario you're putting your opponent so fucked up that it's easier for you to adapt, because it's easier for you to adapt or easier for you to condition because they only have 2 options or they only have 3 options in this said scenario, right? Like Fox back air, Cloud back air, on shield. Like you're extremely limited on options. That's why the Fox player or the Cloud player can do a million other things. They can like set up another jump. They can turn around and grab. They can do a block string, right? Like Fox back air into up tilt, or Cloud can like back air in the forward tilt, which will, beat everything that isn't block or a specifically timed spot dodge and stuff like that. So I think at the end of the day, it is going to be adaptation. And this is a great topic because, I mean, adaptation is something that's really, really important, right? And I think what Tony said earlier is the most important at all levels of play. And this is going to be like top player in pools. They do this, they don't have to put as much energy into it because the level of adaptation they're going up against is usually not like top level, right? If a top level player is playing through their pool, it's usually lower level players. So like the levels of adaptation / conditioning aren't going to be as intense. They're going to be like, oh, okay, well, because one thing too is so I'm unique in a sense where I'll play with. I don't play the game often, but when I do play, I play with people that are just much better than me. So it's like, even it's so weird for me when I play someone that's not a top player or not really good at the game, and then I'm just like, wait, what? Like this is weird because they're not reacting, or they'll like preemptively do stuff. Like a very specific example that comes to mind is against good players, I'll like ledge drop double jump and I'll empty land right in front of them and I'll just shield because they're looking for a ledge drop double jump fair from Fox, right? They're respecting that option. So I can always gauge someone's reaction, even like when I like ledge jump. What does X player do when I ledge jump, and at what point do they react? Because sometimes against top players, I have to like ledge jump and then double jump immediately and then go into a fastball because there's like layered pump fakes into that, right? But if I do that against someone that isn't a top player, they're not even really trying to react to like these pump fakes I'm threading in. Like I'm overthinking the situation entirely. Like they're probably just gonna fucking nair, right? Like they're just probably gonna throw a hitbox out in some area, and they made the decision to nair before I even did my option off the ledge. They're probably just like, if I see movement, I will nair, right? So, and there's nothing bad about that because there are like levels to being able to react to specific things, right? So it's no knock against anyone, but like, for example, I can do like this intricate, like, oh, okay, against Void, I'll do like ledge drop, double jump, and then he's going to respect me in shield because like I've played this player and like usually that's what they're supposed to do. But if I'm playing at lower levels of play, I'm like using a tactic that is just not even good because the X player is just going to nair, right? So there's different levels of conditioning that you have to use, and it depends on like what part of bracket, and it all really comes down to gauging, like Tony said, right? Like right when the beginning of the match, right when the match starts, you are already, there's so many things you have to pick up on. Like, okay, so are they swingy? Are they offensive, defensive? At what point are they reacting? Like how good is their reactions? And you have to kind of test the waters, right? And that's why when you see two top players, sometimes like both of them will be really defensive and they're feeling each other out, right? There's, okay, how are you playing today? And obviously there's previous encounters that will go into the information war, but it's a very big deal. It's a very big deal, and you can and a big thing is how you cash out from it too, right? Because if someone cannot beat a specific thing, there's two things that probably are happening. Either they just don't know how to beat it, or they're waiting for the opportunity to get something big off of beating it, right? So those two things, it's either one or the other for the most part, or both players just don't even know what kinds of interactions are happening, which is also possible too, right? So the main thing is for you as a player to be able to feel out specific things, and it's way easier to feel out a situation when your opponent has less options, which ties back into how good your character is and how you set up said scenario, right? So, for example, I'm like just from the character I play. So for Fox, right, my best scenario is if I fall on top of you with an aerial. Doesn't matter which one. It's a very general concept, right? I just need to be above you, and I need to be falling on top of you with an aerial, and I cannot be anti-aired. That's like the scenario I want, preferably like Fox's main win condition, right? So I can do this with various amount of things. It's harder to anti-air back air because there's a little bit of range, right? So most anti-airs are right above said character. So I can kind of mitigate the anti-air part by depending on like which aerial I'm using. Or do you have worse options out of shield behind you? Now I can start doing like cross-up nairs and stuff like that, right? So I just, at the end of the day, you want to put your opponent in a situation where they have limited options, and then from there you can condition, right? Because they have way less options to pick from. So if my opponent only has two options or 2 to 3 options when I back air their shield, then it's way easier for me to condition them because it's like, oh, okay, well, I scout out the first couple scenarios. Okay, you like to jump out of shield, right? Say this person likes to jump. Okay, that's when the back air up tilts start coming out, right? And then there's also safer options to scout out information, right? Like, for example, when Fox or Cloud back air someone's shield, if they dash back, that's a very, very safe option. Jumping after back airing is also another safe option. I would say it's not the safest option. You're getting a little bit more greedier, right? Because you're trying to set up another like layer of offense. But dash back generally after shield pressuring someone with a fairly safe move, like a -3, -5, something like that, for the most part is really safe, and you can use that to scout out information, right? And you can, from there, I think a big part of conditioning as well is understanding the emotional state the player is in. So this is where we are going to dive deeper into just like not the moves, right? Knowing when someone's scared, knowing when someone's nervous, knowing when someone's playing not to lose. These are all big red flags that you can use, and you can use to your advantage to condition your opponent to know the scenario a little bit more. Because when you know someone's emotions, that's when it's like, okay, the way I like to explain it is, if the main thing you're looking for is like, okay, are they going to do something defensive or offensive? The first like 2 general groups you want to group things into is that. Because if you know someone's going to do something offensively, then it's either a swing and a defensive option. The thing about a defensive option, like you can go be all crazy and be like, oh, he's going to do a specific air dodge to that platform and yada, 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 right? But top players at the end of the day, they don't have to condition that specifically, because a defensive option is the easiest to react to because no attack is coming at you. And there's usually lag, except neutral air dodge. So neutral air dodge is probably the hardest defensive option to punish when you're in advantage state for the most part. There might be some other ones, right? But generally, neutral air dodge has like the least amount of lag, and especially if you're on a fast faller like Fox is known for having an incredible neutral air dodge into the ground into like said reversal. So those ones are a little bit harder. But even like rolls, right? There's usually defensive options have this window at the end where there's a little bit of lag. So it's like, oh, you did directional air dodge. And technically, neutral air dodge still has a little bit of lag. It's just very small. So if you're looking if you can just group things up into, oh, they're going to do something defensive or they're going to do something offensive, I think that's a very good place to start when it comes to conditioning. And then it's on you to react to the defensive option, right? And even the offensive option. When you're spacing around offensive options, that's where you're like spacing around specific attacks. That's where it gets a little bit more intricate, because it's like, okay, well, what attack are they going to swing with? And then that kind of depends on where you position, right? But with defensive options, it's a lot easier, because if it's like a directional air dodge, it gives you a lot of time, right? If they jump, they just reset the situation. So it's like, oh, you jumped? Okay, sick. Resource burned. And then now I need to understand how you operate without a jump, right? Because then it's like, okay, so you burn a jump in disadvantage. Now, do you like to swing and try to go for the reversal after you burn your resources? Like, are you the like quote unquote desperate type where it's like, oh, okay, well, I burned all my resources, fuck it, I'm tripling down and I'm like swinging, right? Or do you try to reset the ledge? Do you go for some kind of air dodge, right? So as long as you can group it into defensive or offensive, I feel like you can get a lot out of it.
I think kind of summarizing what you and Tony both said, because like Tony's point with like the distance to a door determines what they do, right? It is basically saying we are determining an opponent's response based on our distance to the opponent. And then from Charles, we can say, well, depending on the emotional state of the opponent, we can determine certain responses as well. And I think at the end of the day, what you want to do is you want to have as many of these like paradigms through which you can view the game as possible. So in last episode, or let me put it this way, because I don't know the order. In the stage control episode, I talked about the various dynamics that you can look at space through and time, right? So there's like spacing, movement, there's your time mix-ups, etc., etc. And I think all of these are ways to categorize what the opponent is doing, and what you're essentially looking for, and this is I think what Tony was getting at, is you're looking for one of these paradigms that your opponent is not aware of. Because once you realize that your opponent is not aware of one of these paradigms, they're not making choices within that realm. So let's say our opponent is very aware of our distance to them, right? So like a lot of Samus players will be this way. They'll be charging, and you'll come towards them. As soon as you enter your burst range, they're going to try to hit you. They're going to stop charging, release it, charge off forward air grab, etc., etc. And that's like, like we can play that interaction. But we can also say, well, what if we focus on just like, the stage control of the situation, which also has a lot of impact on the situation. And then you can see, well, can I change her decision making based on the stage control? And then again, we get a yes/no answer. If she does change her options based on stage control, then we have control over what she's doing by changing the stage positioning, right? Because if we know, in like when I'm in center and she's in the corner, she acts a certain way, then we can answer that situation, and through that have a bit of control over the outcome of what is coming up. But if she doesn't, then she is the one not controlling it, so we can have full control over it, right? So what we're essentially looking for is we can test them on like distance, we can test them on stage control, we can test them on the percentages, we can test them on kill pressure, we can test them on timing mix-ups, we can test them on emotional state, we can test them on so many different things. And what we're essentially trying to do is we're trying to find a hole in the armor. And once we find that hole, that is where we ideally want to strike. But while searching for that hole, we're also like asking ourselves, like, how do they react in these dynamics? Because a hole can be, they're not making a choice. But a hole can also be they're making the same choice every single time. Yeah, the door is making a choice when you're coming closer, but it's the same damn choice every single time. So we're just going to do it over and over and over until we win, right?
Until they pass the test.
Exactly. And that is like why top level Smash is so awesome, is because like they will decide sometimes they will respond to you, and sometimes they'll just be stubborn and say, no, I'm not going to respond to you. And that's the awesome part of it. So I think like if you want to talk about like adaptation and like top level conditioning, I think a lot of it has to do with like, are you playing as many dimensions as possible? And can you find a dimension that your opponent doesn't play? And there's been times where like I lost to someone in like Smash 4, and I was like, dude, you kept catching my my defensive options out of the corner. What did you do? And it was Fatality. And he was like, yeah, if I dash dance here and then with a nair at this distance, you always pick a defensive option. And I'm like, how many layers deep are we going? But that is the degree to which some of these players are comfortable. And he probably, like, you know, if you want to break it down, he probably conceptualizes it more as like, you know, he's defensive. So like you said, Charles, there's no attack coming. I can do whatever I want, right? And then he figured out a sequence of options that kind of like was my door sensor that caused me to act. And then, you know, 1 + 1 is 2. And at the end of the day, I think part of it is the awareness of like your opponent, right? So like what dynamics are they not playing? And part of it is having awareness over your own dynamics, right? So like you gotta know how you tend to react to situations as well. Like, for example, the Samus player who often reacts to a certain distance, there's a reason that Samus players do that, because that is, well, just a weakness in the character itself, right? Like she can kind of struggle to play mid-range in a non-committal way, because, you know, grab is good, but it's committal. Her short hop fair is good, it's committal, etc., etc. Her charge shot, it's a resource, she has to charge it. So oftentimes it's a bit of a combination of like, what is the character good at, and what are you good at? And then once you realize, okay, I'm doing this because my character is bad at it, you can do it and see if your opponent is aware of it. And if they are, you need to be aware of the fact that you're also doing it for a reason, and then play the resulting situation. So it's very important to me to contextualize what the opponent is doing, both in the limitations of the character, right? So oftentimes what you find is that a weakness gets patched by a pattern. So you think about like Greninja, bad out of shield. What do most Greninjas do? They don't shield. They rely on movement like dashes and full hops, right? So we have a pattern that solves a weakness, but that has to still be a choice. So there's the weakness of the character, right? So the limitation of the character in shielding, and then there's the limitation of the player. And what you, if you want to talk about like top level, and this is, I think, what Tony was getting at, mental stack, right? The stack. So what it often comes down to, and again, for most people not applicable, but it's cool to know, what it often comes down to is mental stack. Once you start testing all of these different dimensions, and like a really good player, they'll be able to keep up with you on all of them, but they cannot play all of them at the same time. And that's kind of the point that you want to push them to. You want to push them to the point where they cannot keep up with all of it. And then, you know, you strike in when it gets too much to handle.
Even the speed of the mental stack's a big deal too, right? Like,
exactly,
like Spargo and Light, sometimes like the mental stack becomes overwhelming, but then the faster you make the mental stack and the wider you make it at the same time, which is like what faster characters can do, like Fox and Cloud, that's when it comes like really hard to deal with. But yeah, sorry, go on, Tony.
Oh, you're good. I was gonna say, I think Fatality is a great example. He's one of the kings of conditioning for sure. I think that he was actually the original pioneer of using shield to attack, and by that I mean he would intentionally shield and then jump out of shield to jump in, because it usually conditions people to see that defensive option visually, and then so you're going to switch your rock paper scissors to counter on a reaction to it if you're trying to play as fast as you can. And so if you're trying to keep up with rapid fire rock paper scissors, it's like playing a game of bop it. You hear the bop it, and then he changes to spin it as soon as he can. And so it throws a lot of people off, and then he just jumps in with a stomp, and then they'll just run right into it because they're trying to dash grab the shield. So a great example. Honestly, speaking of conditioning, the way I wish people used it was the way most, I think, competitions use conditioning, which is essentially as a specific kind of training. And that is to say, they are conditioning themselves to have things like trained responses in this case. So I think that one of the most common requests I have is for people either looking to improve their response time, people who struggle to react to the opponent coming in, high pressure situations, they feel like they're always too slow. And so they'll tell me things like, oh, I expected this to come, and I tried to press whatever in response, and I'm just always too slow. And so invariably, whenever I ask the question, well, what do you do to train your reflexes? What do you do to condition yourself to respond to the situation? The answer is almost always, well, I think about it. The thing about conditioning is that it is one of the most physical aspects of the game. If you don't physically condition yourself with a controller, like less so to Ramses, but for Charles and I, for example, we don't really sit down and just condition ourselves to respond to the same situation over and over and over until it becomes a reflex. Like if we were to see a jump squat, we're probably not going to respond until that character's in the air, whereas someone who is deep in the trenches on competition, if you aren't reacting to specifically just like the first frame of a crouch and realize, yeah, that's not a crouch, that's a jump squat right there. I need to anti-air now. Then you haven't conditioned yourself. And so that's one of the big differences between people in positions like coaches versus top players, is that to be a top player, it's not just a matter of knowing that you're supposed to anti-air somebody's jump in. It's a matter of you actually have to go through the motions of practicing responding to these flashcard scenarios as fast as you can. And if you can't, you just lose. It's really that simple. It's a matter of athleticism. You need to be able to respond to things as fast as you can with the correct button input. And it's really just that simple. You just press A when you see the A button pop up on the screen. So part A is being aware that you're supposed to know, which is recognizing that there's the press A prompt on your screen. And then part B is, of course, pressing A. So that is what I think a more appropriate use of the word conditioning would be if it were used. I think that's part of the reason why it annoys people like Ramses, is because conditioning is usually referred to as how you affect your opponent. The person you can condition the most is yourself, and you should be using it to condition yourself because you can control how you respond to situations. So you just need to think about what the situations are going to be, maybe flow chart it out. It's very common to actually just flow chart out a game of Smash before you play the game. And then when you watch the replay of the game you just played, ask yourself, well, did anything happen in the game that I didn't expect on the flow chart? If something new happens, then you should be modifying your flow chart. If it's a matter of, oh, well, the flow chart went as expected, but I just misplayed this or I misplayed that, I didn't react to the situation popping up or this branch of the flow chart, you need to condition yourself. You need to practice. And that is what conditioning, that is probably the biggest difference between low level, mid level, and top level players, is how much they have conditioned themselves. Because that level of muscle memory is something that takes time to build up.
Can I ask a question, Tony? If you use the example of the sliding door, it sounds to me like you look at conditioning more about recognizing ways in which the opponent has conditioned themselves rather than ways that you are actively conditioning the opponent. What do you think?
I think that the direct application to that analogy is, so for those who did not see it on Spotify, the first door was actually opening and closing too slow. And so I had to look at the next door just to be able to portray the analogy, because the correct and simplest counter to the first door was just to go fast, because it was moving so slowly, it was not conditioned to open. And so what we would do to improve the door's position or relationship to me in this equation, it would be to oil the tracks, to do something to improve its physical capacity to improve here. And so ultimately, there was such a skill gap there between me and the door that I could just walk into it while it's closed every single time without having to try, without having to think, because it's too slow. And so the game was over at the start. And so I couldn't even portray the rock, paper, scissors element of the equation because it just wasn't skilled enough. And so we needed to look at the next one that is more properly conditioned to perform here.
Yeah, and the crazy thing about conditioning as well is, like, at least for me, I remember having a bunch of tricks. Now, obviously, we talked about conditioning, and the most easy time to do it is when your opponent has less options, right? So talking about conditioning in neutral, I think, is the hardest thing, because there's so many different check marks, right? Like, if both of us swing, is there just someone that wins? Like Palutena is usually someone that's like, if we both swing, I win kind of character, right? Or if a character with disjoints like Cloud or something like that. So there's like a bunch of different things you have to take into account. What range are we at? If we both swing, who's going to win, right? Who's faster? Stuff like that. So when I think of conditioning, the easiest way to talk about it is some kind of advantage state, right? So there's even general concepts of like, oh, if they're vulnerable and they see something that looks like an attack, what does player do? These are very like common scenarios in which your opponent has limited options, where you can be like, okay, it's much easier to gather information here because they have way less options. And for example, one thing I used to do when I like competed a lot more seriously, like within the first 6 months of Ultimate, I played Wolf, and one thing that I love to do is I love to fake down tilt with crouch. So like someone would be on the ledge, and then I would down tilt them to hit them off the ledge, right? Because they ran out of ledge intangibility. And then if they normal get up during the down tilt, I would usually have enough time to grab or something like that, right? And then, once people would start to see like the down tilt animation, they would get up attack, right? That is the correct response to that. So like one of my big baits, and this was cool because I loved this bait specifically because, and this is like such a simple bait, but it worked on top players when I grinded back then. So I would walk up to the ledge after down tilting them, right? And then I would just walk up, I would crouch, not too long though. So I'd crouch for a little bit, and this is when you need to understand how fast your opponent's reacting. So if I need to scout out like, okay, how long do I have to crouch until the other player processes, oh, down tilt, and then they do said response, right? And then after I crouch for X amount of frames or however long I feel like it takes them to react, then I just go into shield, up smash or down smash, like drop shield down smash usually would like destroy people at like 30-40% back then, right? So that's a very specific conditioning sequence or whatever, right? Where it's like I understand the opponent is vulnerable and I'm showing them, and it's all about masking your intent, right? And Bam really likes talking about this topic in any like fighting game, Smash or traditional fighters. But masking your intent is a very big part of conditioning, right? Where it's just like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to show you a crouch which looks like a down tilt and you're vulnerable. So you're vulnerable right now. You see something that looks like an attack. What do you like to do? Do you like to swing back with like some kind of intangibility, like a get up attack, right? Are you again going to be more defensive about it? Are you going to try to go into a ledge jump? Are you going to try to go roll? Like a ledge roll is like more of a defensive rather than offensive option, right? And this is all little pieces of information you can gather, and even like hitting people with knowledge checks too. Another trick that I like to do with Fox is I like to make it look like I'm going for a forward smash 2 frame, but a lot of people don't realize how not laggy the forward smash is. Like the first actionable frame on Fox's forward smash is actually pretty quick. So it's definitely not like if I forward smash someone's shield, they can definitely up smash out of shield or do whatever to me, right? But so it's still laggy, it's still like laggy-ish smash attack, but it's nothing like up smash. Up smash is really, really laggy, whereas forward smash, it's not so laggy, and a lot of people will be surprised because they'll try to punish and then Fox can shield in time, and then they'll get up smashed or something, right? So I will forward smash someone, and I'll try to make it look like I'm two framing them, but I do it on a little bit on the earlier side, just a tad bit though. So instinctively, they see, oh, you whiff smash attack by ledge. I grab ledge. That's an easy ledge drop double jump aerial, right? And then I go in the shield. They ledge drop double jump aerial, and then I up smash out of shield. And that is a specific bait to make it look like I fucked up. Because I'm masking my intent because I'm making myself look vulnerable. Oh no, I mistimed my smash attack. Don't hit me, right? And then it's crazy because there's a lot of conditioning sequences where a player won't even know that they did it, or like a player won't even know that they wanted to do that option. Because again, I like with these specific tricks that I've come up with, I've even hit top players with it because it's a natural instinct to do specific things. Like Tony said, most players, they condition themselves because they've gone through these scenarios so much times, because you don't have time to think at top level of play, right? Whatever you're going through all of these very fast scenarios, you don't have time to be like, oh, well, last time, like you just do shit, right? Like it's just instant. So you have to be able to do that. So understanding someone's like subconscious in the game is so important too. And with those little tiny tricks, those are just fundamental things that players like to do. And one thing that I always say when I'm fighting a top player is like, I'll do something the correct way. I'll do like correct responses, or I'll think like in my world, it's like, okay, well that's what a good player is supposed to do. And then I get shit on for it, right? Because like they understand that, they know how to cover those like better options or good options and stuff like that. So even it gets really interesting when you talk about masking your intent, because that's where you get into the tricky stuff. Like even Fatality's example of like, oh, I whiffing a nair. And this is something that a lot of players would do, even in like Smash 4. Whenever I specifically think about this, I think about Tweak's Smash 4 Cloud. he would whiff nairs like specifically at very specific ranges to get people to do things. And so it's not even like, oh, well, I back air your shield, right? So it's like, okay, I back air your shield and you only have like 2 options. That's super easy to condition, right? But then it gets really intricate when you're just like, oh, if I whiff an aerial and I need to whiff it like close enough, because if it's too far, then it has no effect, right? But if it's just close enough, that it's where it's like, oh, well, like you're making yourself look vulnerable, right? Because it's like, oh no, I whiffed an aerial kind of close to you. Like, you could entice someone to do an aggressive option, right? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a specific move, but if you know an aggressive option is coming, then usually defensive options beat aggressive options, right? You can go into like a shield or something like that. Not all the time, but just that general concept of masking your intent is so important. So, a lot of players get a lot out of it. You can get really early stocks and you can get a lot of damage. And then you can get your opponent to like hesitate in specific scrambles if you beat them out, right? And once you get someone hesitating, that's going to give you more time to set up whatever your game plan is, which is extremely strong.
And I love that example of like the whiff, right? Like just like Fatality. Because like at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're abusing an advantage in knowledge. Because like when you're whiffing that back air, you do that knowing that a whiff here is not going to lead to like a bad situation. Whereas like you said, like intuitively it should. And so again, like it's all about like finding dimensions, finding dynamics that the opponent is not focusing on. And I think in terms of like intentions as well, something that I talk to talk about with like my higher level students a lot is like the most concrete layers that you can play the game on. You can look at the game as like individual interactions. You can look at the game as individual situations. You can look at the game as individual strategies. But you can also look at the game as individual intentions, right? And they all kind of flow into each other. It's like interactions that exist in situations, strategies encapsulate situations, and intentions lead to decisions in terms of the strategy that you want to use. So if your intention is to get out of the corner, you probably have, if you're a good player, like 3-4 strategies to get out of the corner, and then it just becomes a mix of like which strategy do you apply. But you can also say, well, I can counter the intention of trying to get out of the corner in general, and then it doesn't matter which strategy you use. I'm going to play it in a way that I have like a minor advantage against all the strategies that you do to get out of the corner. And then the opponent can say, well, in that case, I'm not going to intend to get out of the corner at all. My intention is just to fight you from this position. Fuck you. I'm not going to do it. And then that's like the thing is like you can play the game on all these layers, right? And there's probably way more, right? Like there's also like the whole psychology sitting behind it all, right? So that's generally the layers to talk about: interaction, situation, strategy, intention, psychology, in that order, from like most objective interactions to most subjective, which is psychology, right?
Yeah.
And I think intention is one that is still very it's on the more abstract side, but it's still concrete enough where like oftentimes if you look at the strategy someone uses, you can kind of like infer the intention. But also, if you look at the way someone sets up situations, you can also infer intention a lot of the time, right? So it's still concrete enough to play towards it. So the whole idea of masking intentions, like Tony said, your opponent needs to be good enough for it to be useful, right? Like the door needs to be fast enough. But if the door is fast, then you can see, well, what is the cost of that speed? Like you said, Charles, right? When the mental stack starts having an element of speed to it, it gets more complex. But there is a spectrum of speed and quality, right? Because the longer you spend on a decision, generally the better the decision is going to be. Of course, there's diminishing returns, right? But generally, right, playing a little bit slower, like, for example, Tweak plays on the slower end, has extremely high quality decisions. Whereas Spargo just like puts the pedal to the metal, and sometimes he does the dumbest shit. Like you'll see Spargo like run up smash out of the corner. And sometimes he gets away with it because it's just too fast, and sometimes he gets punished really hard because it's not the right option. And like that spectrum is an important part in your adaptation as well. It's like sometimes, like if your system cannot handle what the opponent throws at you, a decision that you can make is like, okay, well, where on the spectrum do I want to be? Can I try to play it faster to try to, kind of like sneak some things in that the opponent might not be ready for just because of the speed? Or do I take it slower and then instead try to rely on like really high quality decisions where my opponent might use that time that I'm giving them, with my slower decisions to set up even better situations, but at least I know when I'm in those situations, I'm playing it as well as I can. So again, like a lot of dynamics that you can rely on, and I think whiffing something is definitely something that works really well, for example, against someone who's trying to play fast. Because when you're playing fast, you're going to be recognizing situations in a more generalized way, because that is how you get faster, is by not being too specific about the information you're taking in, because it's too much to process if you want to be really fast. And so you give them the generic situation of, I whiffed. And what is a generic response to they whiffed? It is, I have advantage.
My turn.
Exactly, my turn. They whiffed, you failed. It's time for me to shine. And so what happens is the generic response to whiff is answer. But if you're playing against Tweak and you whiff something like that, you bet your bottom dollar that he's going to use that room not to hit you, but to set up pressure. He's going to, maybe even pluck a banana. Maybe he's going to jump in and get pressure. Maybe he's going to use his burst range to mix you up, right? So like these ideas, they're all very good. But again, you got to test for the weakness in the armor. You got to see where is the dynamic lacking, and then kind of like adjust your strategy, adjust your situations, adjust your interactions, adjust your intentions to then counter theirs. And again, if your opponent is making deliberate choices, right? So if it's like, I cannot just counter their intention because then they're going to counter my intention, and then I have to counter their intention, and kind of like go into the, like the wine in front of me. So I knew it would put it in the wine in front of you, but the wine in front, like the whole Princess Bride thing. Once you go down that rabbit hole, that is where masking your intentions becomes really powerful, because now it's not just about like countering, it's also about like being 2 steps ahead, because like you're countering an intention, but you're not even sure if that is their actual intention. Yeah, fun, top level coaching. But really some of the more awesome parts of the game for sure.
So I believe it was Ramses earlier who mentioned the relative distances and how that's used in conditioning. And I think that is one of the major things I like to use to convey how it affects neutral. So the idea is every player has a rubber band attached to their character, and where it's attached to is going to be at least 2 points. So it's going to be their character, and then there's usually stage positions and or an opponent. So it's essentially what their heart desires the most. And so usually, and most commonly, this is their opponent's character. And so the idea is there will be a set distance where they like their character to be from their opponent's character. So not always, but this is very common in my experience. And so the idea is if you pull that rubber band a little bit, they'll snap right back to you. And so this is probably the most universal preconditioning that I've observed. And I think that the best way you can use it is just pull the rubber band. And so the idea is that you essentially can use it like a wrestling ring where you just pull it back and then go right in. And so I know there was a high-level player I was recently going over, and I pointed out that he was getting caught up in a matchup where his opponent would just jump back and then immediately fastball and dash attack. And it worked almost every single time. And the reason was because every single time his opponent pulled that rubber band, he would instantly just jump right in because he'd think that they were backing up, and he'd go and try and take in the stage control. And he wasn't even aware that he was doing this. It was just a preconditioned reflex that he had that usually works out for him. Because it just on law of averages, if you take more stage control more often, then you're probably more likely to win the match. And so that's how you end up at the top of the dog pile in the first place. So the concept here is that if you identify what your opponent is attaching the rubber band to, because sometimes it isn't your character. Sometimes there's a specific set point on the stage. Like I know we mentioned in the Samus episode that there's a Samus putting up a charge shot under the platform. And so recognizing that Samus has that rubber band point set, even against top player, or especially even against top Samus, you can actually just get ready to attack that spot under the platform if you see them get too far under it, because you already know their next movement option is going to take them straight there. And so you don't know exactly how they're going to get there, but they will get there. And so you can just narrow it down by putting things out between them. And so as far as this applies to neutral, that means that anytime you see your opponent, once you've identified what this point is, you can identify any time that they move outside of that range, then you know they're snapping back to it. And so you can just actually respond to them having that relative spacing, whether it's to your character, a point on the stage, maybe there's an item that they spawn. But once they get too far from that distance, they're always going to move toward it every single time. And so recognizing that is very helpful. Another point of reference I think is very helpful is recognizing specifically how your own relates to that. Because if your opponent is taking advantage of it, then just being aware that you have that habit means that you can just choose to do literally anything else once they start to use it and take advantage of it. And so that will actually throw off your opponent's game just because you were aware that you had that own vulnerability in your own play. And so by recognizing that your opponent has taken advantage of it, there's a few ways you can take advantage of this fact. And like Charles mentioned, you can either just take advantage of it normally and just respond instantly by changing, or you can put it in your back pocket and just say, well, they know that every time they dash back here that I move in, and so I'm vulnerable to this dash attack. And so next time you see them dash back, you just walk up and forward smash, and they'll just dash attack right into it. And maybe if you took advantage of that right away, yeah, you would have hit them and made them have to guess and figure out their game plan again. But if you put it in your pocket and hold on to it for a few interactions, you're going to get a full stock instead of just 20 damage from it. And so this comes down to risk reward, because how you take advantage of conditioning, both for yourself and your opponent, is also going to have that in context, because everything kind of flows together. Your understanding of reading, your understanding of stage control, how you are presenting your neutral game, the risk reward of everything. These things all work together and flow into each other. And so there is no just single best thing you can be doing. It's always going to take everything else in context.
Yeah. And what I guess my final piece of advice before we end the episode is I guess I'll go over some of the things that kind of frustrate me when I play other players that are just a lot better than me. And in terms of like,
for this.
Well, in terms of like what I hate, in terms of like when I'm playing someone that's just a lot better than me and then they condition me in certain aspects, right? So, and I think this ties all in and kind of puts a bow on the episode, but like the way you got to look at the win conditions, right? So Fox's win conditions earlier, we went over wants to fall on top of you with aerials and then dash attack for the most part, right? So it's like on the ground, I can nair vertically or I can nair horizontally, right? Because like nair and dash attack are like essentially the same move. There's like a hard hit and then there's a sour hit, and then I want the sour hit, and I can usually combo off of both hits, but like the sour hit's the better one, right? So the thing about that is you got to make the option look juicy, right? And the thing that really annoys me is when someone just makes an option look so juicy that, again, like my subconscious activates, right? Like, oh my God, that's like such a great scenario to just nair into, right? And then they'll dash back and then like whiff punish my landing and stuff like that. So then you got to add more layers, right? And then even for dash attacks, like top players, they understand specific distances where dash attack can hit, and then if I close that distance even a little bit more and I'm not dash attacking, they can react and be like, okay, now it's a grab mix up, right? So I shielded for dash attack, but then again, these are scenarios that top players can do because their refresh rate is so high. Like they at like dash attack distance, max dash attack distance, they're understanding and knowing the scenario like subconsciously, where it's like, okay, shield here, no, and like I cannot get hit. And then Fox takes like those extra 2 steps, and they're like, okay, now it's like I can spot dodge or I can jump, right, to try and avoid it and stuff like that. And making the option look juicy it's so important, right? There's so many times where I'll subconsciously just go in with the dash attack because, you know, the top player just makes the scenario look so good, where it's like, man, they haven't shielded for so long. So in my brain, I'm like, okay, they're just moving. And with Fox, if you see someone just moving around, dash attack's incredible. The only thing that it could lose to is maybe a jump, but it depends on like how fast falling the character is, right? If it's a floaty and they jump and I dash attack, most floaties can't really do anything about it. So even just understanding what your opponent wants, and once you understand that, you can try and create scenarios that look like they can activate said win condition, right? Like, oh, look at me, I'm moving around here, I'm not shielding Fox. Like, you don't have to grab, you can swing here, and then getting the Fox to come in and swing. And obviously dash attack is very exploitable and stuff like that. Because really, when I'm a Fox, like when I'm playing Fox, the main thing is like, where are the shields? That's the main thing I have to know and understand about my opponent. Obviously, there's a bunch of other things, but if I know when and where my opponent shields, that's when I can start getting grabs. But and even if I know when they shield and when they don't shield, that's when I can get hits too, right? So I can get hits or grabs if I understand when and where my opponent likes to shield. So just that aspect alone, and there's so many times where like top players will bring up their shield just before the dash attack comes out, right? Because like if you're fighting up against at least a semi-experienced Fox, if you hold shield for more than like half a second or a second, they should not be dash attacking into said shield because you already showed the thing that beats out a swing, right? For the most part, like beats out at least dash attack. And that's where it's like, okay, now I can nair to punish shield a little bit safer, where it's like, okay, you're going to shield where I'm going to nair, and then now the scenario is really good for me, right? So no matter which way you slice it, it's all about the Fox player knowing when and where the opponent wants to shield and be defensive. So if you can manipulate the Fox into thinking like, oh, okay, well, I'm not shielding, I'm very vulnerable, right? Again, just kind of linking back to the vulnerability part. That's where things can get really frustrating for a Fox player, right? And you can apply that same mentality to a bunch of other characters' win conditions. So it's like Ramses said, it's about knowing so much about the game and then it ties into itself. And you obviously can't know that if you don't know and understand Fox, right? Because once you know and understand Fox's game plan, then you can start adding more of like the personality part to it or the emotional side to it, right? Because if you don't understand Fox as a character or like Rom as a character or Pikachu as a character and you're going up against all these said characters, then it's a little harder to tie in the emotion part to it because you don't even understand what they're generally what their win conditions could be, right? Because even when you break down Pikachu, mean. Right? Because we break down Pikachu and there's like Esam, who's like playstyle wise wants to go for edge guards, right? So maybe a little bit more aggressive neutral to set up more aggressive advantage state, and then there's more conservative Pikachus like Shiny Mark, where it's like, okay, well, I'm going to be a little bit more reserved with my options, right? I'm going to go for the timeout if I have to, more T-Jolts in neutral. And then Shiny Mark will still go for edge guards, but the way Shiny Mark opens up these edge guards are going to be more in a defensive manner. And like, okay, well, the main scenario that Shiny Mark is looking for is like, I'm going to throw T-Jolt out. What do you do against T-Jolt, right? And if it's a neutral option, like, oh, and Shiny Mark has the lead, well, that neutral option is not that great because you eventually run out of time, right? If you're going for... So eventually, you're going to have to go up and over the T-Jolt. Like, you're going to have to approach Pikachu through these T-Jolts, and that's the main like piece of the puzzle Shiny Mark is looking for, right? How are you going to approach me through this T-Jolt wall, right? Whereas Esam might try to set up T-Jolts, but it's more of like, okay, I'm going to T-Jolt a couple times, but I'm not going to do it to time you out. I'm going to T-Jolt to check you a couple times, but eventually I want to see how you run away from me and disengage from me because you're scared of my offense, right? Because when Esam engages his offense, it's very scary. So he's using his offense as a conditioning tool because it's like, oh, okay, well, Esam on hit is really fucking scary, right? So a bunch of different stuff like that. Did you guys have any other closing words before we close out the episode?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Ramses.
Oh, I was first. You go ahead.
So I was just going to specifically point out, I believe that it's a common analogy to say that Smash is a language. I forget if it's neutral as a language or Smash as a language, but either way, to tie into Charles's point, if you don't know enough about their character, about the game, then it doesn't matter that they're telling you, hey, you could beat me if you do this, if you can't speak the language in the first place. So you should probably learn both languages before you start trying to play your own. So you were going to say, Ramses?
I was going to say the exact same thing. I think you got to you got to understand what an action means, and you can only know that if you understand the character. So, yeah, very good point to finish us off, Charles. I appreciate that.
All right. So that's going to be the end of this episode. Again, if you guys enjoyed the content, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. That helps us out a ton. And also, make sure to leave a comment and let us know what kind of topics you want us to cover here at Coach's Corner. And until next time, class dismissed.